After years of abuse, I left my husband with nothing, and he still begs me back. The morning it all changed, I woke to the smell of coffee burning on the stove again. God, he was always doing that, forgetting things, leaving them halfway done like everything else in his life. His name? Lucas. He had this way of talking to me as if my existence were an inconvenience he tolerated because he didn't know any better. Like when he'd say, "Sophia, why can't you just," and then trail off, letting the silence do its work. That silence felt heavier than words ever could. I sat up slowly in bed, wincing at the dull ache in my ribs from last night's argument. Argument, that's what we called it now. Not fight, not assault. Just another disagreement where voices got loud and hands found their mark. My fingers brushed against the bruise under my shirt, and I flinched. "Lucas?" I muttered under my breath, tasting bile in the back of my throat. "You've really done it this time." He was already downstairs, pacing the kitchen like some caged animal. Even through the floorboards, I could hear him muttering to himself. Probably something about how unfair I was being or how hard he worked for us. Always the martyr, never the monster. When I finally made my way down, clutching the banister like it might save me, he barely glanced up. His blonde hair stuck out wildly, like he'd been running his hands through it all night, which he probably had. Stress did that to him, or maybe it was guilt dressed up as stress. Either way, it made him look younger than his 35 years, almost boyish, almost harmless. "You burned the coffee again," I said flatly, leaning against the doorway. My voice sounded strange, detached, like someone else was speaking for me. He froze mid-step, turning to face me with those piercing blue eyes. They used to make me feel seen, cherished even. Now they only reminded me of storms waiting to break. "Oh, great. Another thing to add to your list of complaints." His tone dripped with sarcasm, but underneath, I heard the edge, the anger, simmering just below the surface. "It's not a complaint," I shot back, surprising myself with the sharpness in my voice. "It's a fact. You burn the coffee every single time. Maybe try paying attention?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he'd lash out right there. Instead, he grabbed the mug off the counter and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, shards scattering over the tile like broken promises, and that's when something inside me snapped. I stood there, staring at the mess, feeling nothing. No fear, no sadness, just emptiness. How many times had I cleaned up after him? Swept up pieces of dishes, wiped away tears, patched together what little dignity I had left? Too many to count, but not anymore. Without saying a word, I turned and walked back upstairs. Each step felt deliberate, intentional, like I was reclaiming control inch by inch. In our bedroom, I pulled out the old suitcase from the top shelf of the closet. Dust floated around me, catching the sunlight streaming through the window. For once, it wasn't suffocating. It was freeing. Packing didn't take long. Clothes, toiletries, a few keepsakes, nothing sentimental, nothing that tied me to him. As I zipped up the bag, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. Dark circles under my eyes, hair tangled from restless nights, lips pressed into a thin line. This wasn't the woman I used to be, but maybe it was time to find her again. Downstairs, Lucas was still standing in the kitchen, staring at the broken mug. When he heard me coming, he spun around, panic flashing across his face. "Where are you going?" he demanded, taking a step toward me. "Away," I said simply, gripping the handle of my suitcase tighter. "Far away from you." For a second, he looked lost, like a child who'd been abandoned. Then the mask slipped back into place. "You don't mean that," he spat. "You'll come crawling back. You always do." That stopped me cold. Slowly, I turned to face him, meeting his gaze head on. "Not this time," I whispered, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. "I'm done." And just like that, I walked out the door. The bus station smelled like stale air and regret. I sat on a plastic chair, clutching my ticket like it was a lifeline. Around me, people bustled about, oblivious to the war raging inside me. Was I doing the right thing? Could I survive without him? Then I remembered the bruises, the insults, the endless apologies that meant nothing. Yes, I could survive. I had to. As the bus pulled up, I took a deep breath and stepped aboard. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, was a new beginning. All I had to do was reach for it. The bus ride was a blur of highways and half-forgotten towns, each mile marker ticking away pieces of my old life. I stared out the window, watching the world rush past in streaks of green and gray. My reflection stared back at me, pale, tired, but determined. This wasn't just an escape, it was a declaration, a promise to myself that I'd never let anyone treat me like that again. But promises are easy to make when you're running on adrenaline. Sitting there, clutching my suitcase like it held all the answers, doubt started creeping in. What if I couldn't make it on my own? What if Lucas found me? He had a way of finding things, or people, he wanted. The thought made my stomach churn. I shook my head, trying to push the fear aside. "Focus, Sophia," I muttered under my breath. One step at a time. When the bus finally pulled into the station, I didn't recognize the town. It wasn't glamorous or particularly welcoming, but it was far enough from Lucas for now. That's what mattered. As I stepped off the bus, the air hit me like a slap, cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of rain. Perfect weather to match my mood. I wandered aimlessly for a while, dragging my suitcase behind me, until I stumbled upon a small diner tucked between two crumbling brick buildings. The sign above the door read, "Ruby's Place" in faded red letters. Inside, the smell of grease and coffee wrapped around me like a warm blanket. For the first time in days, maybe even years, I felt something close to comfort. "Can I help ya?" a voice called out. I looked up to see a woman behind the counter, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked about 50, with curly brown hair streaked with gray and eyes that seemed too kind for someone who worked in a dump like this. Her name tag said Martha. Yeah, I stammered, suddenly keenly aware of how disheveled I must look. "Just coffee, please." She nodded and poured me a cup without asking questions. Small blessings. As I sipped the bitter liquid, I glanced around the diner. There were only a few other customers, a trucker typing furiously on his phone, an elderly couple sharing a plate of pancakes, and a young guy sitting alone in the corner. He looked barely older than 20 with messy black hair and headphones dangling around his neck. Something about him caught my attention, not because he was remarkable, but because he seemed so ordinary. "Safe. You new around here?" Martha asked, leaning against the counter. Her voice was casual, but her eyes were sharp, taking me in. "Yeah," I admitted after a moment. "Just passing through." She raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, she slid a menu toward me. "Well, if you stick around, Ruby's is always hiring. Not much else going on in this town, though." Ruby's hiring. The words echoed in my mind as I finished my coffee. Work wasn't exactly part of the plan. I'd left Lucas with nothing, not even a bank account. But bills don't stop coming just because your life falls apart. Maybe sticking around for a little while wouldn't hurt, just long enough to get back on my feet. By the end of the week, I was officially a waitress at Ruby's place. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid cash under the table, which suited me fine. No paperwork meant no trail for Lucas to follow. Plus, there was something therapeutic about serving food to strangers who smiled politely and left decent tips. They didn't know me, didn't care about my past. To them, I was just another face in the crowd. Martha turned out to be more than just a boss. She became a sort of mentor/guardian angel, offering advice when I needed it and leaving me alone when I didn't. One night after closing, she handed me a keychain with a tiny silver heart dangling from it. "For luck," she said with a wink before heading home. That same night, I got my first glimpse of trouble. Trouble came in the form of Lucas calling my burner phone, a cheap flip phone I'd picked up at a gas station. His number flashed across the screen, making my heart race. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want?" I snapped the second I picked up. "Sophia." His voice was strained, desperate. "Where are you?" "None of your business." There was a pause, long enough for me to wonder if he'd hung up. Then softly, "You can't keep running forever." Anger surged through me, hot and raw. "Watch me." Before he could respond, I ended the call and powered off the phone. My hands trembled as I shoved it into my pocket. How had he found the number? Had he been watching me? The question swirled in my head, threatening to drown me. A few days later, the young guy from the corner booth introduced himself. His name was Liam, and he had a habit of showing up late at night when the diner was nearly empty. He'd sit in the same spot, nursing a cup of coffee and sketching in a worn notebook. Sometimes he'd glance up and catch me staring, giving me a sheepish grin before returning to his drawings. Tonight, though, he lingered longer than usual. When I approached his table to refill his cup, he cleared his throat nervously. "Hey, thanks for putting up with me. I probably take up too much space here." I shrugged, forcing a smile. "It's quiet. You're good company." He hesitated, then blurted, "Are you okay? You seem distant." The question caught me off guard. Most people avoided prying, especially in places like this, but Liam looked genuinely concerned, his brow furrowed beneath his mop of unruly hair. "I'm fine," I lied automatically. Then, surprising myself, I added, "Just figuring things out." He nodded slowly, as if weighing my words. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm a pretty good listener." For a moment, I considered telling him everything, the abuse, the escape, the constant fear of being found. But instead, I simply said, "Thanks, Liam. I'll keep that in mind." As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he saw right through me. Maybe that was why I kept coming back to Ruby's day after day, because despite the grease stains and fluorescent lights, it felt safer than anywhere else I'd been in years. Weeks passed, and life settled into a fragile rhythm. Work, sleep, repeat. I rented a tiny apartment above a laundromat, furnished with mismatched furniture scavenged from thrift stores. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Every night, I locked the door 3 times and checked the windows twice. Paranoia became my constant companion. Then one evening, as I walked home from Ruby's, I noticed a car parked across the street. It wasn't familiar, but something about it set off alarm bells in my head. The driver's seat was empty, but the passenger window bore a crack shaped like a lightning bolt. My blood ran cold. That crack. I'd seen it before. In photos Lucas had sent me years ago, bragging about his new ride. Without thinking, I ducked into the shadows of an alleyway, heart pounding. Was he here? Had he followed me? Panic clawed at my chest as I fumbled for my phone. I needed to call someone. Anyone. But who? Martha? Liam? Before I could decide, headlights flicked on, illuminating the narrow alley. Footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder with each passing second. And then, a voice. Low, menacing, and achingly familiar. "Sophia?" The sound of his voice sent a jolt through my body, like an electric current tearing through every nerve. I froze, rooted to the spot, my breath hitching in my throat. It wasn't just the tone, low and measured, dripping with that mix of anger and desperation I knew so well, but the way he said my name, like it belonged to him, like I was still something he owned. I turned slowly, forcing myself to face him. Lucas stood at the mouth of the alley, silhouetted by the dim streetlight behind him. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his leather jacket, but his posture screamed tension. Even from here, I could see the storm brewing in his eyes, the same storm storm that had raged inside our house for years. What are you doing here? My voice came out steadier than I expected, though my knees felt like they might buckle beneath me. I clutched my phone tightly in one hand, as if it could somehow shield me from what was coming. He took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between us. You left without saying goodbye, he said, his words laced with accusation. After everything we've been through, you just disappeared. My stomach churned. The audacity of him, to act like he was the victim, to twist reality until it fit whatever narrative he wanted to believe. But I didn't have time for this game. Not now. Not ever again. I didn't disappear. I shot back, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. I left. On purpose. And you know exactly why. His jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might explode right there in the alley. Instead, he stopped moving, standing just a few feet away, close enough to reach out and grab me if he wanted to. That thought made my skin crawl. You think running solves anything? He spat, his voice rising. You can't fix us by hiding, Sophia. We're not done. We? I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off the brick walls around us. There is no we. There hasn't been for a long time. His expression shifted then, morphing from anger to something darker, something dangerous. He tilted his head, slightly, studying me like I was some puzzle he couldn't quite solve. You really mean that, don't you? He murmured, almost to himself. You actually think you can walk away and start over, without me? Yes, I said firmly, meeting his gaze head on. I do. For a second, silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Then, unexpectedly, his shoulders sagged, and he let out a long sigh. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost pleading. Come home, Sophia, please. I miss you. Their words hit me like a punch to the gut, not because they hurt, but because they didn't. They meant nothing. Empty promises wrapped up in pretty packaging. How many times had I fallen for this act before? Too many to count. No, I whispered, shaking my head. Not this time. Something flickered across his face. Anger, frustration, maybe even fear. Whatever it was, it vanished quickly, replaced by a cold determination. You'll change your mind, he said, taking a step back toward the street. When you realize how hard it is out there, you'll come crawling back, just like always. And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he'd appeared. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty space where he'd been. My legs felt like jelly, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. But despite the fear coursing through me, I also felt something else, something unexpected, relief, because for the first time, I hadn't caved to his manipulation or let him guilt trip me into submission. I'd stood my ground, and that gave me hope. When I finally managed to move, I practically ran the rest of the way home, locking the door behind me and leaning against it until my breathing slowed. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in on me. As memories of Lucas flooded my mind, I sank onto the couch, clutching a pillow to my chest like a lifeline. That's when I realized I couldn't keep doing this alone. Living in constant fear, jumping at every shadow. I needed help. Someone who could understand what I was going through. Someone who wouldn't judge me for the choices I'd made, or the ones I still had to make. The next morning, I called Martha. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. Hey, kiddo, what's up? I need a favor, I said, cutting straight to the point. Do you know anyone who can protect me, or at least teach me how to protect myself? There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a soft chuckle. You're in luck, she replied. Ruby's has more regulars than you'd think. One of them used to be a cop. Retired now, but he knows his stuff. Want me to send him your way? Yes, I breathed, relief washing over me. Thank you. By lunchtime, a tall, broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair walked into Ruby's. His name was Roy, and he carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that only came from years of experience. After introducing myself, I explained the situation as best I could, leaving out most of the gory details but emphasizing the danger I felt. Roy listened intently, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a moment. You're stronger than you look, he said finally. But strength doesn't mean much if you don't know how to use it. Over the next few weeks, Roy became my unofficial mentor. He taught me basic self-defense moves, showed me how to recognize potential threats, and even helped me install better locks on my apartment doors. With each lesson, I felt a little safer, a little more in control. But safety wasn't the only thing I gained during those weeks. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Liam started creeping into my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. At first, it was small things. Him offering to walk me to my car after late shifts, texting me random jokes to brighten my day. But soon, those gestures grew into something deeper. Conversations stretched longer, laughter came easier, and for the first time in years, I found myself looking forward to seeing someone outside of work. One evening, as we sat together at his usual booth, Liam looked up from his sketchbook and caught me staring. What? He asked, a playful smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Nothing, I said quickly, feeling heat rise to my cheeks. Just thanks for everything. His smile softened, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then quietly, he said, You deserve happiness, Sophia. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. Maybe he was right. Maybe I did deserve happiness. And maybe, just maybe, I was finally starting to believe it. But happiness has a funny way of slipping through your fingers when you least expect it. Because 2 days later, later, as I arrived at Ruby's for my shift, I found Lucas waiting for me outside. This time, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a woman, a stranger with fiery red hair and a glare that could melt steel. Her arm was linked possessively with his, and she wore a smug grin that made my stomach turn. "Meet Natalie," Lucas said, gesturing to her with a flourish. "She's helping me win you back." Win me back? The absurdity of the statement almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I squared my shoulders and stepped closer, refusing to let them see my fear. "Whatever game you're playing, Lucas, it won't work. I'm done." Natalie smirked, tilting her head slightly. "We'll see about that." As they walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over, far from resolved. In fact, it might just be the beginning. The days that followed felt like walking on a tightrope stretched over an abyss. Every step I took was deliberate, measured, and filled with the gnawing certainty that one wrong move could send me plummeting back into the chaos I'd worked so hard to escape. Lucas showing up with Natalie hadn't just been a surprise. It had been a declaration of war. And if there was one thing I'd learned about Lucas, it was that he didn't fight fair. Natalie's presence confused me at first. Who was she? New girlfriend? An accomplice? Or worse, someone hired to make my life even more unbearable? Whatever her role, her confidence radiated like venom, seeping into every interaction we had. She was smart, manipulative, and clearly enjoyed playing games. Games I wasn't sure I could win. But here's the thing about being backed into a corner. Sometimes you find strength you didn't know you had. Sometimes you realize that staying silent is no longer an option. It started small, little things, designed to unsettle me. Notes left on my car windshield, text messages from unknown numbers, even a bouquet of flowers delivered to Ruby's with a card signed simply, "Thinking of you." Each gesture was calculated, meant to remind me that they were watching, that they weren't going away. At first, I tried ignoring them. Roy had taught me how to stay vigilant, how to spot patterns in behavior, and I clung to his advice like a lifeline. But as the incidents escalated, from harmless pranks to outright intimidation, I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, especially not when Liam noticed. "You're scared," he said one evening after closing, catching me staring blankly at the empty diner. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were sharp, cutting through the walls I'd built around myself. "I'm fine," I lied automatically, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He shook his head, pulling out the chair across from me. "Don't do that. Don't shut me out." For a moment, I considered brushing him off again, telling him he didn't understand, that this wasn't his problem. But then I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Trust, loyalty, someone willing to stand beside me, no matter what. So I told him everything about Lucas, the abuse, the years of silence and shame, about leaving, running, trying to start over, and finally, about Natalie, and the growing sense of dread that shadowed my every move. When I finished, tears streaming down my face, Liam reached across the table and took my hand. "You're not alone in this," he said firmly. "Not anymore." With Liam by my side, I decided it was time to take control. Hiding hadn't worked. Avoiding conflict had only emboldened Lucas and Natalie. If I wanted peace, if I wanted freedom, I had to confront them head on. But I couldn't do it blindly. I needed proof. Evidence that would expose their tactics for what they truly were. Harassment. Roy agreed to help. Together, we set up a plan. I installed a security camera outside my apartment and kept detailed records of every incident. Martha pitched in too, keeping an eye out at Ruby's and reporting anything suspicious. Slowly but surely, the pieces began falling into place. Then came the night that changed everything. I was heading home from work when I spotted Lucas's car parked near my building. My heart sank, not because I was surprised. He'd been circling closer for weeks, but because this time, he wasn't alone. Natalie leaned against the hood, arms crossed, her red hair glowing under the street lamp like flames. They were waiting for me. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to approach calmly, gripping the pepper spray Roy had given me. "What do you want?" I demanded, stopping a safe distance away. Lucas stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I snapped, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. "Leave me alone," Natalie smirked, pushing off the car. "Oh, sweetheart, we're not leaving until you listen." That's when I noticed it, the envelope in her hand. She waved it tauntingly, like bait. "This might interest you." Against my better judgment, I moved closer, snatching the envelope from her grasp. Inside was a stack of papers, photos, documents, screenshots, all of them detailing my past, my mistakes, my secrets. My blood ran cold. They dug deep, uncovering things I'd buried long ago, things I thought no one would ever find. And now they held them like weapons, ready to destroy me if I didn't comply. "Give these back," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't yours." Lucas stepped closer, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Come home, Sophia. Let us help you. We can fix this together." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "You don't get to decide my future, not anymore." Before either of them could respond, headlights illuminated the street behind me. A car screeched to a halt, and Roy emerged, his imposing figure casting a long shadow. "Get in the car, Sophia," he said firmly, his gaze locked on Lucas and Natalie. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a frustrated growl, Natalie tossed the envelope to the ground and stormed back to the the car. Lucas lingered a second longer, his eyes burning with fury. "This isn't over," he spat before following her. As they sped away, I sank to my knees, clutching the envelope tightly. Roy knelt beside me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did good," he said softly. "Now let's finish this." The next morning, I filed a restraining order against both Lucas and Natalie, using the evidence they'd left behind. It wasn't easy, reliving the trauma, recounting the abuse, but it was necessary. For the first time, I stood in court and spoke my truth without flinching, without backing down. When the judge granted the order, relief washed over me like a tidal wave. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was enough. Enough to give me space to heal, to rebuild, to live. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal, or at least a version of it. Liam stayed by my side, supporting me in ways I never thought possible. Together, we found joy in the little things. Shared meals, quiet evenings, laughter that echoed through empty rooms. And those scars remained, both visible and invisible. I carried them differently now, as reminders of how far I'd come, of how strong I'd become. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Liam turned to me with a soft smile. "What are you thinking about?" I hesitated, then smiled back. "How lucky I am. How much I've grown." He nodded, squeezing my hand. "And how much more is ahead." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. Like maybe, just maybe, the best chapters of my story were yet to be written.